Well, thank you all very much. There's like a love-hate relationship with introductions like that. You were like, make sure they got that on tape. I do, as you'll see, generously post on social media, so my mother will love to see that. But then you're like, how do I live up to that? Like, there's nowhere to go but down. But thank you for having me here. And I mean that in the broadest sense, not just for this community lecture, but truly to be here at BC. Just a couple of notes about that before I launch into this lecture, which I hope will be in the spirit of this being about social media, which is very interactive. I hope will be very interactive. I'm leaving time at the end for questions. And if you are just moved to ask questions during it or to offer insight, I'm down with that as well. But the reason that I'm so thrilled to be here is, first of all, I toured Boston College as a senior in high school. For those of you who don't follow me on Twitter, you may not know this, but my guidance counselor in high school encouraged me not to apply. I come from a poor blue-collar city in far western Massachusetts, and like many of those cities, had great guidance counselors who grew up in the neighborhood next to me, but not particularly sophisticated. Doug Flutie had just thrown that miracle pass in Miami, and so they may have been onto something. Every kid, I think, in North Adams was Catholic. Back then, North Adams had 7 Catholic churches. They were organized by your heritage. You either went to the Italian church or the French church. You weren't supposed to do it that way, but everybody did. We actually went to the convenient church in the West End most of the time, only because my parents couldn't agree if they should go to the Italian church or the Irish church, and so we went to the nearby church. I was an altar server there and didn't realize until I was in college when the Pope made this great decision that girls could be altar servers. I was like, that's why they never had my name on the calendar when the bishop came for Mass. I did every other 9 a.m. Mass. But anyway, I didn't apply to BC. And actually, that story has a lot to do with why I've dedicated most of my life, both in public service and since, to education, because there was a lot of inequality in education, both in access to higher education opportunity, to information about it. I think a lot of that has changed, but I got into politics because when I went to Trinity College, and I know we have some Trinity College students here, I discovered that my preparation for college was starkly different than that from some of my peers who had been presented with a very different level of education. I was lucky, though, through hard work and some other skill sets that I'll go through in a little while. I've been given enormous opportunities in my life. But I do think when I graduated from college, my dad desperately wanted me to apply to law school. And probably like some of you, whatever my dad always wanted me to do wasn't always exactly what I decided I wanted to do. And so I took the LSAT, and my dad would tell you I did just well enough that if I had decided I wanted to apply, I could have gotten in, but not so well that I felt compelled that I had to apply. And so I went to work in politics and decided at some point I would go back and get my master's degree or maybe even go to law school. To this day, my mother still asks me when that's going to happen because I haven't made it back yet. So being here at BC Law is kind of making up for a lot of things for me, but truly the part of the Rappaport Fellowship of encouraging the best and the brightest to engage in public service is, I hope, something that all of you will consider, whether you're going directly into the private sector, don't know what you're going to do. There are so many ways to engage in the public sector, and it has been the most rewarding, most of the time fun, and I have made some of the best friendships in my life, many of those folks who will be coming to speak in my seminar. So The other reason I'm glad to be here is that for 10 years I was blessed to be able to teach at Williams College. And I taught a course in political leadership, and I got great advice from the chair of the department, who said to me, he actually could have been related to my father, he wasn't, but he said to me, we have a lot of people who could teach theoretical political science way better than you. We don't need another person trying to pretend they understand that. Teach the things and talk about the things that our students will benefit from that only you know best. And so as I put together both my seminar and this presentation today, you'll see I stick to the things that I know best. And so as we go through and talk about equity, I'm going to look at that through the lens of women's equity. That does not mean that's the only equity lens that is out there today. Clearly it's not, but it is obviously the one where I have the most experience, where I've spent the most time doing research and study. And so also I'm going to be really challenged to keep this into the time that I'm allotted. And so that's where I will focus my remarks, happy during my office hours when I'm here to expand on other areas of equity for those of you who may be interested. So, impact of social media on equity in the US political system. And as I said, I got this great advice early on, stick to what you know, do the things. And so I thought I would start with what's my perspective? Where do I come to, besides being an observer, where do I get my perspective? So I'll give you a quick grading of the governor. Social, I am aces, right? You probably already picked up on that. I have already charmed the audiovisual crew. We've got a plan if the mics go out. Trinity College, when I was at Williams, this was a better joke, but I used to tell my students, you're probably smarter than me. There's no way you had more fun than me in undergrad. I learned a lot of the skills that actually were transferable and helped me in politics. Although I will tell you, there's something very funny about political leadership. The higher that you go up, being social isn't always a great thing, because it can be very lonely to be at the highest levels of leadership. A story for another day, but particularly when you're doing grassroots campaigning, that social piece of social media is something that I have nailed. I love people to laugh at my jokes. The great thing about social media is that you can pretend everybody finds you entertaining, whether they do or not. Media, if any of you want to do a Google search on me, and you can get beyond some of the work I've done since I've been in the private sector trying to clean up my own persona on the media, you would find that media hasn't always been a kind medium to me. I'm going to show you some examples of that. I'll also talk about how media can be challenging for women in general. The most important thing when you encounter something, and I tell my own daughters this, that you don't do well, is to learn from it. I was really good in face-to-face media and giving in-person speeches. When media and public speaking transitioned into one of those lenses, and it wasn't just about befriending the guy behind the camera, but really channeling and talking to people in the camera who you couldn't see, who you couldn't make direct contact with, I found that very challenging. And the leadership lesson that I took away from it was, it's really hard personally to take something that's always been a strength and admit that it's now a weakness. You move into a different setting, maybe a bigger arena, and it took me a long time to realize I needed to get myself back into media training and sort of learn to do things differently in a different media setting. So I grade myself pretty harshly there. And then because social media is kind of a mishmash of both of those things, I give myself a B+. But social media is a great tool if you know what you're using it for. Today, I actually don't I use it the same way most women my age use it, for one thing, which is to brag about my kids, which fortunately, I have great kids to brag about. Ruth asked me, so most of you are the age of my kids, so this will not be relevant for you, but for those of you who remember, you will be shocked to know that my twins are now freshmen in college. I actually when they went off to college, and at the same time I was coming back to Boston. This is the first time I've worked, right? It's like a soap opera. You all don't remember what soap operas are either. But when there were soap operas on the network TV, right? There were soap operas on network TV. They would have babies, and then a couple months would go by, and then they would have teenagers, right? It was a miraculous thing. I did the same thing. But seriously, when I was getting ready to come back to Boston to be more public again than I've been in a long time, my husband actually made me weed my Instagram feed down to people that I actually knew, and to only post things about their college exploits on Instagram. I'm fairly good about that, but sometimes they just do such extraordinary things that I get a little bit out over my skis on Facebook, which is face brag for all the moms and grandmoms in the room. On politics and policy, I do stay in the flow. I feel a big obligation to continue to give back, particularly to help other women. I think diversity of perspectives is important. And frankly, a lot of people helped me. And so helping other people where I have the time and energy and where I can actually be of help is important to me. Data and technology, this has to do with the course that I'm teaching, is what I've now worked in for the last 15 years. And I didn't give myself a grade because it really just depends which rubric you're using. If you're judging me as a former governor, I am like pretty good, because I put this PowerPoint together all by myself. And I know what a PowerPoint is, and I can use this clicker, and I can go both forwards and backwards. That probably puts me at the top of the former governor heap. But if you were to put me in the startup technology CEOs, some days I'd be okay, some days not so much. So if you want to look at my social media presence, I'll show you a few things. Twitter, I use for a blend of professional and political, and a whole bunch of sports. And I did comment on the recent goings-on of the Red Sox last night, and I was doing a little live tweeting for the Democratic debate. Facebook, as I said, is my mom brag. I've turned Instagram into private, more or less family. LinkedIn, and I think there's only a handful of overlap. I am going to say this right now. If you are a student and you don't have a LinkedIn account, you really, really, really need to start a LinkedIn account. Every internship you go to, every employer that you go to look for is going to look at your social media presence. Yes, you should clean up everything else, just like I did on my Instagram for completely different reasons, but really there's only so much you can do about mistakes you've already made. But what you can do with LinkedIn is you can make that your preferred landing page for all your professional accomplishments and build that up, and that begins to then become the dominant place that people connect with you. I had different issues because luckily there were no cameras or cell phones when I was in college. Otherwise, I would not be here. But back to that, how much fun I had. But I do have stuff like people wrote about me that isn't the first thing I want somebody who is thinking of putting me on their board to see. I use LinkedIn and maintain that to get it to the top of my search engine in a way that I'm curating and controlling what people see about me. I also have a Wikipedia page, which probably most of you don't. If you do, then you could probably teach me a few things, but that's a story for a different day. The other thing I would say, unless your name is like John Smith, if you haven't bought your own .com name domain, you should probably go out and do it and keep it current. It costs like $5, but that's another good way to make sure that you can always control your own narrative. You're probably not ever going to run for office. Maybe you're never going to start your own law firm. You'll be shocked that when you go to look, somebody else may already own it, in which case buy your .net or .something else, because you may want it someday, and just maintaining that for $5 a year or whatever it is on GoDaddy is probably worth it. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of my Twitter presence and how social media in a professional capacity. I had 1,800 followers. This was actually last week. I think I picked up a bunch more trash talking during the Democratic debate last night. I have no verified presence. I joke that that's on purpose so I could disavow everything I say. I actually just have never gone through the process of doing it. Interestingly, in November, this is probably partly because of Patriots playoff football and some other things. I had my all-time high number of impressions, 195,000 impressions on my Twitter feed. And the Rappaport announcement was the one that was shared the most. So again, just sort of staying constant and knowing what it is people are seeing, what they're feeding about you, I think is really important. And we'll get to sort of how that builds into your narrative and how you use it as a political leader and how you can create better equity. And then just because, how many people watched the Democratic debate last night? How many people stayed up to the bitter end? So it was hard. It was pretty boring. About a quarter or a third of the way through. So I watch both sports and political events and use Twitter at the same time. It drives my husband crazy. I find it interesting because it's kind of like live commentary and I have a very diverse feed. Someone turned me on to the fact that during the Democratic debate, Mike Bloomberg's Twitter feed, at first it seemed like it got hacked. Did anybody see this last night? So he started doing things like asking which meatball you thought most resembled his face. I'm not kidding. And then he changed his profile picture to a meatball. And then you can see there were all these tweets like, which song, not instead of Hail to the Chief, should Mike Bloomberg walk into? One was like Shallow, or maybe he should sing. I mean, it was really out there stuff to the point people were legitimately like, I think he's been hacked. And then this morning, if you look, he posted, and by the way, I wasn't following Mike Bloomberg yet. I went on and followed Mike Bloomberg in the middle of all of this because it was a deadly boring debate in many ways. And so what are you going to do? I'm trying to stay up and watch the whole thing. Bloomberg, first thing this morning, said, now that I have your attention, look what Trump said last night, and this is actually really serious. Now, I'm not sure I subscribe, and I'm going to talk later about the good, the bad, and the ugly about social media and how it's impacting our social discourse. Because, first of all, Mike Bloomberg is not the person that I would have expected to resort to the extreme silly to get eyeballs, because he can buy eyeballs. I did get nominated to potentially be his Massachusetts Twitter promoter by other people on social media last night, and I was thinking that was probably a pretty high-paying job. But it's interesting, right? Like the stuff that goes on in social media and politics is extraordinarily different than the type of dialogue. I'm looking at Lissy, who is horrified, right? Like the type of dialogue, the type of discourse that was happening 10 years ago, maybe 24 months ago, has dramatically changed, and a lot of it is happening through Twitter. This is not a Trump statement, whether you like that or hate that. I thought this was a great example that it's changed and it's probably not going back. And every political leader is going to have to figure out how that works for them. I'm going to move on and talk about the different challenges women have had in achieving power, and some of them are with the media, and how this new media offers both advantages and disadvantages. But that was just to get attention sometimes, right, on social media. You have to be way out there and striking, and some would say not particularly presidential or CEO. You sort of wonder what the current leadership of Bloomberg News was thinking as they were seeing all of that and monitoring that and their reputation last night. So I think to take a step back now, there's a question that we need to frame, right? If we're going to talk about how does social media impact equity in the political system? Did we have equity? And again, I'm going to do this through the frame of for women. Did we have equity before social media? That's not a yes or no question. We're making progress, right? Really, really slow progress. So, and I redid my slides, but that last number is 29%. So in Congress, we're up to 23.7%. That's statewide elective. These are Center for Women, American Women in Politics, almost 29% of statewide elective offices are women, from 27% at the beginning of the 2000s, and then the number to the right of that, our state legislatures are also only about 29% from 22%. You know, at this rate, we'll reach parity. Is there a math major who can do that for me? I won't be alive to see it, so somebody take a victory lap. Actually, probably most of you won't either. But there's good news. 2018, one of the biggest challenges to women, and this actually does apply to every underrepresented group in terms of equity, incumbents win. We all say we hate the political system. This was even before we had all these change elections. We all say we hate the political system, and then we all vote for incumbents. And usually, by definition, underrepresented groups are not incumbents, right? But in 2018, women outperformed as challengers. So challengers are people who are running against incumbents, for those who aren't as dorky and immersed in politics as me. Both Democratic challengers and Republican challengers, which is really interesting because it was a terrible year for Republicans. I predict it's going to continue to be a terrible year for Republicans for a whole host of reasons that we absolutely cannot get into here. But Republican women challengers would have been running against Democratic men challengers in 2018, and they also outperformed. So that is a good sign that women are running as challengers and winning more frequently. So what are the traditional barriers that have prevented us from, if any of you, actually I know Avery is working in a firm that does a lot of work in venture. Any of you who think about technology, worked in technology maybe before going back to law school, there's this great thing in venture capital. I suppose it really happens for some companies, but it is what everybody has to put on their slide deck if they want to get venture money, called the hockey stick, right? Like you go along, you build your company, and then all of a sudden one day you get hockey stick type growth numbers. I'm still waiting for the hockey stick in women's political representation. It hasn't happened. What are the things that prevent us, to bring my two worlds together, from getting a hockey stick type of occurrence in women? So there's a couple of things that I've talked about through the years. One is hair, hemlines, and husbands. There's all kinds of research that the press in particular, but even voters, because voters are what are responding to the media, pay more attention to women's looks, to what they wear, and to what their marital status is. So yes, I had children while I was in office for a long time. I'm very proud of it. I love my children. I face brag about them, but it was a huge problem. And not because they were bad kids, and not because I wasn't hugely proud of them, and not because, frankly, it isn't the most important thing that ever happened in my life, but for a lot of time, the only thing you could read about me was about my kids, which that made my mother thrilled, and a lot of people loved to read it. But if you wanted to elect me, you really needed to know what I thought about education or what I thought about other things. And it just invited all kinds of criticism on issues that are unresolved in society, about that we heard a little bit about in the Democratic debate last night, about raising children and childcare and all of that. The other two issues that have traditionally been difficult and have been seen in research as barriers to women's political achievement are fundraising and ambition. both of those have actually been trending in the right direction. So I wasn't exactly sure how to put the arrows. So down arrow implies bad, but what I meant is they're less of a barrier. So read it that way. And also, if you've ever been a McKinsey or any kind of a consultant, I know this is a terrible visual slide. I have people who have worked for me who did better slides than this. It would make them crazy. It was as good as I could do, but I did, again, do it myself. So anyway, fundraising, and this is an area where I'm going to talk about the impact of social media, but women have been catching up on fundraising. And most interesting, some of the occurrences of the last couple of elections have actually generated more interest among women. And there's some research that says young women are more interested in politics and in running than young men. And that's the first time we've seen that kind of data. And so that should mean more women run, because one of the biggest barriers traditionally to women's political representation hasn't been that they didn't win as often as men, it's been that they didn't run as often as men. And then when you combine that with how difficult it is to beat incumbents, so if you don't run for open seats and you don't win against incumbents and you don't run as often, that's when you get no hockey stick. The last thing, and I haven't seen research on this, this is my gut and lived experience, but if you do get past page like 6, and when I lost my attention span of my Google search, you will see that my family, people around me, and I were exposed, even in pre-social media eras, to some pretty toxic political coverage. Because people pay more attention to women's personal lives, some of that coverage is pretty personal. And in our toxic media environment, and I'm going to talk a little bit about social media, that's getting worse. And I believe that is a further challenge to recruiting the most talented women or any talented person, but especially women, into the arena. I always, as you could probably pick up on, I like to joke about things, even if, particularly if they're a little bit painful. But I used to say it was great that my kids were too young to read, because so were all their friends when I was in politics. But I did have to go through that period. I was out of politics when my kids went back and Google searched me and read a whole bunch of stuff. And my husband and I lived in a lot of, not fear, but just wondered how that would impact them. And as it turns out, like most things in parenting, the things that you really worry about so much are actually not the real things that you should have been worried about. But their perceptions were really interesting. So I think, though, that toxic climate, particularly in social media, is something we should be worried about. I've got 9 minutes to get through this. So what's the impact of social media on political equity? I'm going to blow through this, and we're going to start having questions. In a recent article, we know that one of the things that I said that happens for women is women feel like and are more likely to feel that their appearance and is more quoted on or is more commented on, and that they're paraphrased more often. And one of the great things about social media is you really can get your own words out and you can put your own pictures out. Hence this. On the left, what they would put is a picture of me. On the right, when I get to bring my own pictures, right? I don't need to say much, right? A picture says 1,000 words, right? Which thing would you send out as your Christmas card or holiday card? Fundraising, I actually think social media has had a net positive impact because A, the type of fundraising you can do now is small dollar fundraising. It's not having to call people who you know that can give you $10,000. You don't have to be as connected. You can be talented. You can have friends who are talented. I think this one is particularly interesting and illustrative of the kind of fundraising that's going on. Pete Buttigieg sends out, who I think is very good on social media, says, just send me $1 or $2 and you'll be entered into a contest. But you can also enter, by the way, to win if you don't send money, but send a couple of bucks and you might be able to go to Hamilton with my husband, Chasen. Appeals to a particular dynamic or demographic, those who love Hamilton, and those who may want to go to Hamilton with his husband. But it really also, the thing I love about the way you can do social media fundraising, so much less time. When I was trying to decide when my kids were all under the age of 5, if I was gonna run for a full gubernatorial term, one of the biggest pieces that I was trying to grapple with is all the fundraising happened on nights and weekends. If you're already in office and you have to do all the fundraising because you're not rich, and I wasn't, it's all nights and weekends. And we lived 3 hours from Boston, and if you're a mother with young kids, that is a huge personal toll to be away all the time. And for a lot of reasons that I do not have time to go into, there was no way my family could accompany me even on those political trips. Toxic climate. So, as I said, I think women tend to run less because of the toxic climate, and this is, I think, a draw. First of all, the good thing is, when people were attacking me back in the day, we could fight all night with reporters on the phone, but we had to wait and see what they said the next day, and then try to find people to say things. Now you have your own platforms that you can have line people up, you can respond in real time, you can craft your own narrative, so you can be building. For those of you who were watching the debate last night, Pete Buttigieg was doing this really well. They clearly had not just the campaign, but other representatives who had accounts, who knew already at certain times during the debate what the message was that they were going to push out. But if you didn't know that that was probably what they were doing, it just looked like they had really well-educated folks pushing out really well-articulated messages at really critical points during the debate. How ironic. But it was on point, and his social media team had a much better night than the candidate. And that, right? Everybody has a bad night, by the way. I tend not to. But, you know, people have a bad night. And if you have that ability, right, to be keeping up with it and mitigating the harm, it's very powerful. It's also, I think, empowers younger voters. That's why I like the Hamilton piece. I think the outreach, the engagement. Ironically, none of you will remember, Howard Dean is the person who first started this by doing these meetups early in the internet, where you would just say, everybody come meet at a certain place. That was a thing. And it was like revolutionary. And he started to build grassroots momentum. But the internet and social media in general can be a pretty toxic place. So somewhere in the last couple of weeks, I accumulated this new follower. People tell me she used to, or maybe she still is, a reporter for Fox News, Jessica Reyes. I think that's what she really looks like. Anyway, she nominated me for funniest Twitter person follow in Massachusetts. I told her she may need help. But last night, in the middle of her tweeting about both sports and very appropriately about the campaign, some guy responded with something that was a joke that was clearly beyond my demographic, but it was probably not nice, but called her Blondie. And she sort of said to the Twitter sphere, you know, how do I respond to this? And I responded and said, I think you go straight to block, which, as you see, she replied to me and blocked this guy. But, you know, that was relatively calm. There's a lot of nasty stuff, and a lot of it is around gender, and that was a good example, right? Because she's attractive and young, this guy felt empowered to say something really nasty. Not anything to do with her opinion or to disagree with her, but totally inappropriate. On the other hand, you can just block. But there's also some really bad things about social media, right? It tends to be anonymous. And so people do feel like they can say whatever they want. Like, so people called me fat on, even when they would attribute it to their names. In Facebook, when you can have these fake accounts with these fake names, that becomes a lot easier and it becomes very hurtful. It also, there's a big debate, and we're going to talk about this in my class. It does exacerbate, people find the news that they want. There's a debate whether or not it exacerbates it or not. There's no doubt that people are tending to find the news sources and curate the news sources that agree with their political opinion. Whether they're doing, I have two different articles, both research-based, that come to completely different opinions as to whether or not Facebook and social media encourage that or discourage it, but there's no doubt that it is even more possible to entertain yourself with a lot of news and opinions that are only people you agree with all day long, and I'm sure that's not good for society. So this is the wrap. What's the good? It's a fundraising equalizer. You can control your narrative and message. I think that's good for equity, and it empowers different power centers, particularly the young and the tech savvy. I point out Andrea Ocasio-Cortez and Mayor Pete as two folks who I think built political power using social media as part of the good. The bad, the anonymity, metrication, which I didn't get to talk about, but the fact that we sort of rank everything, that can become a really toxic thing on the internet as well. As I talked about with the Mayor Bloomberg, in this need to get attention, you really can dumb down the level of discourse. I will only say on the flip side of that, I found some really good articles that are really deeply engaging. So if you look, you can find the opposite of that. But it also does become an echo chamber. And I pulled this quote from The Atlantic from a reading we're going to do in class that since 2013 in particular, there's become this sort of accelerator and echo chamber once Facebook and Twitter added the share button so that you didn't actually have to go to all the trouble of cutting and pasting to share inflammatory articles. And then the ugly, which we totally don't have time, and it's not specifically relevant to equity, but around foreign involvement, security, and the one that is related, I think, particularly to women and concerns, is around violence. So with that, there are basically different ways and different proposals of how we can deal with it. We could do nothing. There's self-policing suggestions out there, some very good ones, or we can regulate. Lots of good regulatory proposals. I think these will be widely debated in the next Congress and with the next president. Nothing's probably going to happen right now, but anything from making sure that these media sources are monitored and maybe restricted a little more in the run-up to campaigns, just like broadcast media actually has tighter rules around what you can and can't do in the days, 30 days I think it is, before an election. There are proposals for taxes on data, tighter privacy rules, verifying people's identity. I think the balance is there's something really vibrant and interesting that does have some good. And so how do you balance those two things? And feel free to come and sit into my class, although we don't have a lot of extra seats, if you want to learn more about that. And now it's time. I'm only 2.5 minutes over. And I counted your introduction as part of my 40 minutes. Gee, does anybody have a question? Emily?
Can you speak a little bit more concerning Donald Trump's use of social media and how he's using it as a platform for influencing policy?
So it's really interesting. There's an article we're going to read in class. Donald Trump drove his media coverage through the entire primary and general election through Twitter. And I don't know if there's any media here, and most of them totally want to disavow this now. But the media allowed Donald Trump to set the agenda for how he was covered. Any political candidate would love to be able to do that. And he does it in large part today through Twitter, and it works to his advantage. It is scary because policy is much more complex than what you can see. But what he also recognized, and this is not a value judgment on if it's right or wrong, When we started building software, when I began to work in technology, we were told the instructions that we should put into all of our education products should be largely around a 4th to 5th grade level for teachers. Because once you got way beyond that, you're just running the risk of losing certain audiences. And I'm not sure I totally believe that, but it is very clear to any educated person that Donald Trump is being very focused and precise in making sure that he is reaching the largest audience possible by the words and the word choices that he uses. Much of it is dangerous, provocative, and often racist. But it is, I think, also much more strategic and much more effective in driving his narrative than perhaps folks have wanted. With all the frustration and concern, I think folks have not taken the step back to look at how he's changed the manner of communicating. What I don't know is, so for those of you who watched the debate last night, I thought Tom Steyer, whatever, performance or lack thereof was very interesting, because I think the theory behind Bloomberg, Steyer, and even Yang is, well, Donald Trump didn't know anything and was rich, so anybody's got to be better than him, so all these guys can compete. And what was very obvious last night on the stage is that Tom Steyer cannot communicate in at least in that forum. He is not skilled at knowing when to look at the camera, when to look at the questioner, and it was just awkward to the point of a little cringy, right? Donald Trump had all these weird things that he did, but he knew how to control the camera. And so, well, you make fun of, just like people did for Reagan all the time on TV. Go back to what I said, when I had to start figuring out how to communicate through the television medium, that was a really hard skill. And the other thing is, when I had to start figuring out how to communicate in shorter sentences, which I'm still not good at, that is hard to do. And so it's the other reason the Bloomberg thing is so interesting, right? Because Bloomberg is smart and has governed, and has a media empire. I'm going to try to find a student first, because that's my rule. All right, I can't find one. I'm trying. Let's see, I even try. Oh, there, I found one. Shamed one, maybe.
I was wondering if you had I was wondering if you could comment on cancel culture and how that affects social media usage and equity. I guess we see it more with people of color, perhaps, but I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think it is, I think you see it with people of color, I think also for younger people. So one of the it's a hard word to say, demetrication. I think that this whole thing about figuring out who's important and who's not by how much traction you get, and whose issues are getting attention, I think is part of what you're trying to get at. I
guess what I'm asking too is, you're sort of giving us advice on how to control our image by utilizing social media as a tool. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking that there's so much risk that is involved with having a social media presence as well, because of so how do you?
I know, and I'm trying to think about how I say what I'm going to say, because you're all my daughter's ages, and their friends if you're not my daughter's ages. Um, so I think that it's changing so fast, right? And I think some of the tools that are on there in the cancel culture are impacting. All right, so I'm going to back up. So first of all, you're all this close to a professional life. And my hope is when you make that flip, right, from social media being more the social to more being how you're controlling your professional life, that some of those pieces, how many likes you get on Instagram, starts to be irrelevant and doesn't impact you in any profound way. And that how you present yourself is more about what you legitimately achieve, and that you can do it in ways that are authentic to yourself. One of the hardest things for me early in my career was I was given a lot of advice by a lot of people, right? And had this conversation, I won't say with who, but with Lissy earlier, right? I had people who told me, you need to lose weight, you need to dress differently, you need to wear fingernail polish, you need to wear heels, all these things to manage my appearance. It was, so it's like, that's bullshit, because we're trying to figure out the best economic climate so that small businesses like my dad's plumbing company can exist. And we need to figure out how kids in North Adams can get the same quality education as all the kids, no offense, Emily, who grew up in the main line of Philadelphia and are showing up at Trinity. Like, I have great ideas on that. This stuff, and this is pre-social media, right? But it's some of the same, like people judging you on things they shouldn't be judging on that are very surface. And being true to yourself, whatever that self is, whether it's your heritage, your persona, who you know yourself to be. And when you do that, professionally as well as socially at your age, with social media only amplifies it. When you are true to yourself, there are certain things you're going to decide to do or not to do that actually will have consequences sometimes, that will be painful, right? So I joke that, there are all these, but it was not fun to read some of those articles, right? And it had an impact on me. And eventually I did hire, I call her the dress Nazi. I hired somebody to help me professionally manage my wardrobe. Now, we didn't have a ton of money, and looking like you're a news anchor is a hard thing to do if you're not making money like a news anchor. So we found ways to do that. So like, trying to answer your question, like sometimes there's just not the perfect, but social media isn't gonna go away. And so in my era and now, my decision is take control of the things that exist and decide the places you're willing to engage and set your boundaries. There are some places you can compromise, right? And there are other places, I still do not ever wear nail polish. It's just like a bridge too far, I can't keep up with it. And it's very easy for me to say, don't worry about the cancel culture, but I just had my daughter go through a very, she's very much her own person, had a very painful experience because I keep counseling her that, and it's hard, right? I believe at the end of the day, doing the right thing and standing up for what you believe in, whether it's on social media or in person, is the right thing to do. And I believe that the lack of people having the courage to do that today, this is as close as I'm going to come right now to talking about what's going on in Washington, but the lack of people being willing to do what's right at the risk of their jobs, certain friends, is a terrible threat to our country. And the people that we admire most historically are the ones who've been able to do that. And you don't build that muscle by just waking up one day and deciding, this is the one day I'm going to do the big right thing. I don't know if that helps or not.
I don't think there's a right answer either.
And don't be that person, right? Like, it's a reason, if you're judging people by how many likes they have on Instagram, you're probably missing something in life.
Hi, my name is Chris. I have a question. You mentioned earlier you took more control of certain social media outlets. Are you finding today's culture of social media, especially with all of the risks that you just mentioned, more or less advantageous to even have an account on certain media platforms?
So my husband and I have this debate every day. I find it advantageous. So my girls actually end up finding the nasty things that people still say to me here and there. Like I'll get a stupid helicopter joke, or something somebody will say, and a couple times I'll say to somebody, if you are still worried about something I did 20 years ago, I think you have the bigger problem than I do. And mostly I do that because it makes my girls amused. But I think you have to set expectations, right? So I'm almost 55 years old. I have a certain level of professional success that I can take a few more risks. And it behooves me to stay current, to stay connected. Having said that, there are certain things like if any of you believe that what you see on social media about about anybody is not curated, right? Some of us are a little more unplugged than others, but if you don't think it's not curated, then you're wrong. I think the most dangerous is Twitter. You have to be doing real time. I would say treat Instagram and Facebook in particularly the way that I tell folks to treat email, which is particularly if you're angry, upset. So when you go into the professional world, if people are still using email, or if you decide to do it, the text, and if you're about to hit a nastygram, sleep on it. And I do the same thing on Facebook and Instagram. So I have an idea of what narrative I'm trying to curate about myself. So I am not using those social media platforms to tell you exactly who I am. I am telling those social media platforms to tell you who I want you, the part of me I want you to see. And that's not disingenuous because it's a media and marketing platform. Now, the thing that companies and people need to understand is you have some control, but you also lose some control. But just like Jessica, you can also block people and take comments down. So on balance, I still think it is a net positive to have it, because it doesn't mean you have to have every platform. And so like me, taking Instagram and making that more private to just share birthday pictures and things with family was probably a good choice. Two more questions. You've been patient with me.
I would ask, when you had that chart on women getting more and more elected, did you factor
Incrementally more, yep.
Did you factor in other things such as age and race? I'm looking at.
It's just all women. It wasn't not.
See, I'm wondering whether it really is all women, or whether, Ayana, okay, she's 40, but she's younger than,
That's just total female population representation. Is it getting younger?
If you factored in age and race, would we be seeing more women, or are we seeing more young people and more people of color?
We are not seeing more people of color, because women of color is actually a not very good story. There are a couple very high profile that lead us to the wrong conclusion. Generally, but I will go back, you can go to the Center for American Women in Politics and they break down all the stats. Generally, women tend not to run at as young ages as men do, but that may be changing because they certainly are expressing more interest. I'm not sure that has converted yet to running. One more question, is there?
Hi. So I come from a digital marketing background, and one of the things we often worry about in the business world is that we don't control any of these platforms, and they're all privately run companies. So if Facebook decides to change the way its algorithm works, change its rules for business pages, our entire strategy could go out the window tomorrow. Do you think it's problematic that both for us as budding professionals building our image online and also for our general political discourse that we're relying so heavily on these private actors and we're really at the mercy of the decisions they make about their algorithms?
So that's why I should have had more time for the regulating, but yes. And I think that that's why, particularly for political discourse, I think you're probably going to see some kind of more regulation, especially in the days leading up to campaigns, so that things can't be switched, in the last months, and maybe not in the last weeks, to switch how those algorithms. I also think verification of identities is going to likely get either from, if there isn't wholesale adoption by those large platforms, I think you'll see regulation, and whether it comes by state or by the federal government, I think that's one of the pieces that's likely to get pretty universal. Not that people can't have multiple platforms and you can't have false identities, but you at least have to be a real person. You have to have some way of identifying that you exist and you're not just an AI bot. So from a personal standpoint, I think it's the reason to have multiple platforms, but also to be educated about what's going on. If I see one more person share that story on Facebook, like post this because then you'll come in my feed, or the thing about, oh my God, JetBlue is going to give away 60 free tickets if you post this thing. No, they're not. That's a piece, particularly for older Americans. My mom, my class took a Snapchat with me, but my mom's on Snapchat to keep in contact with her granddaughters. But I worry, especially is the age range on some of these platforms and the susceptibility to scams. That's another whole piece we didn't even get into. Never mind controlling your image through the algorithms. So yes, I think those are the reasons why treating it as a public utility or maybe regulating it more as a media company are going to be heavily debated, and I think likely it's either going to happen state by state or by the federal government, and the degree to which that regulation comes, I think, is TBD. I don't know if I want them. Not sure the federal government determining the algorithms is the right solution, because change happens so quickly. Figuring out the framework by which, though there's some fair way of notification of changes, I think is probably where I would come down. So you can adjust, but that gives, the big companies want to disadvantage the small companies, and figuring out how to level that playing field is not easy.